The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Sophie stepped into the elevator. She was the last person to leave the office that night, and the silence of the empty building pressed down on her like a physical weight. The polished chrome walls of the elevator reflected her tired face, dark circles under her eyes from another long day at work. She sighed and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, a faint chime echoed through the car, followed by a strange flicker in the lights. The elevator lurched slightly before descending smoothly. Sophie shifted uneasily on her feet, glancing at the floor indicator. It moved from 10 to 9, then paused. Suddenly, the elevator jerked to a halt. The lights flickered again, plunging her into darkness for a brief moment before the emergency lighting bathed the small space in a dim, sickly glow. Sophie pressed the door open button, but nothing happened. She jabbed at it again, harder this time, followed by a frantic pounding on the help button. Hello? Is anyone there? The elevator's stuck. Her voice echoed hollowly in the cramped space. A distorted crackle came from the intercom, but no voice followed. Instead, a soft tapping sound began, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere above her. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. Is someone up there? She called out, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was oppressive, suffocating. Sophie's fingers tightened around her phone. She pulled it out and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the ceiling panel. It gleamed back at her, spotless and unbroken. She held her breath, waiting for another sound. A loud, metallic creak shattered the silence. Sophie stumbled backward, her flashlight trembling in her hands. One of the ceiling panels bent inward, as if something heavy pressed against it. Her mind raced. Maybe it's a maintenance worker, she muttered, trying to calm herself. But deep down, she knew no worker would be climbing around without announcing themselves. The creak intensified, and suddenly the panel snapped open, slamming onto the floor. Sophie screamed, her flashlight casting erratic beams of light. Above the gaping hole was pure darkness, but something shifted within it, a hint of movement, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" she yelled, backing into the corner of the elevator. The reply was a low, guttural rasp, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. A hand emerged from the hole, pale and emaciated, with unnaturally long fingers that ended in blackened, cracked nails. It groped blindly for the edge of the opening, pulling a hunched figure into view. The creature's face came into the light, and Sophie's stomach twisted. Its eyes were hollow sockets, its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin, exposing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. The skin clung tightly to its skull, cracked and oozing dark fluid in places. Sophie dropped her phone in her panic, the flashlight skittering across the floor and casting wild shadows on the walls. She pressed herself against the elevator doors, fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. The creature dropped into the elevator with a sickening thud. Its head cocked unnaturally to the side as it regarded her, emitting a low clicking sound that reverberated through the small space. Sophie's shaking hands found the emergency phone compartment. She ripped it open and yanked the handset to her ear. "Please, God, someone help me! There's something in here with me!" She sobbed into the receiver. The line crackled, and then she heard a voice, a whisper, so faint she could barely make it out. "It's too late. It's already chosen you." The creature lunged. Sophie screamed and swung the handset wildly, connecting with its head. It barely flinched, its movements jerky and unnatural as it advanced. The elevator shuddered violently and the lights flickered again, plunging them into complete darkness. In the pitch black, Sophie's screams were muffled by the sound of tearing flesh and that awful, relentless clicking. The next morning, the elevator was found at the lobby level, the doors open and inviting. It was empty, save for Sophie's phone, its flashlight still on, pointing upward at the pristine ceiling. The office building remained silent about the incident, but whispers among the staff spoke of strange noises late at night and shadowy figures seen in the mirrors of the elevator walls. No one rode it alone after dark, ever again.
Story number 2.
The apartment building loomed over the quiet street like a concrete sentinel. Ethan had just moved in, the lure of affordable rent too tempting to resist, even with the odd stories he'd heard from the neighbors. Late at night, the elevator sometimes behaved strangely. But Ethan didn't believe in urban legends. It was his third night in the building, and he was returning late from work. The lobby was eerily still. The only sound the faint hum of the vending machine. Ethan hit the button for the elevator, and it arrived with a soft ding. As the doors slid open, he paused. The elevator was empty, but the air inside felt heavy, as if it were thicker than the rest of the building. Shrugging off the feeling, he stepped inside and pressed the button for the 14th floor. The ride began smoothly enough. Floor numbers lit up in sequence. 2, 3, 4, then a faint static crackled through the elevator speaker, startling him. "Maintenance issues," he muttered, glancing at the speaker. But then the elevator stopped abruptly at the 6th floor. The doors slid open. The hallway beyond was dim, the overhead lights flickering weakly. No one was there. Ethan frowned and jabbed the close door button. The doors began to slide shut, but just before they closed completely, he saw it. Something crouched at the end of the hallway. A figure barely human, its limbs grotesquely elongated. Ethan's heart raced as the doors sealed shut, the elevator continuing its ascent. He pressed his back against the wall, breathing heavily. Just a shadow, he told himself, but the ride grew stranger. The elevator skipped floors, jumping from 7 to 9, then back to 8. The lights inside dimmed, the static from the speaker growing louder. Then came the voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but clear enough to freeze his blood. "Why are you here?" Ethan's eyes darted around the elevator. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The elevator stopped again, this time at the 10th floor. The doors opened to pitch blackness, an impenetrable void where the hallway should have been. "Step out," the voice whispered, closer now, almost teasing. Ethan shook his head, hammering the closed door button. The doors closed sluggishly, as if reluctant to obey. The ride resumed, but something changed. The walls of the elevator seemed to shift, their metallic surface distorting, rippling like water. Shadows moved across the reflections, twisting and writhing, though Ethan stood perfectly still. The static grew louder, transforming into a low, guttural growl. "Let me out!" Ethan yelled, pounding on the buttons, but none of them responded. The elevator was moving on its own now, climbing higher and higher past floors that didn't exist. 15, 16, 17. The numbers climbed endlessly, the growling intensifying, and the shadows on the walls grew sharper, more defined. They weren't just random shapes anymore. They were faces, grotesque and contorted in silent screams, their eyes following him as the walls seemed to close in. The elevator jerked to a violent halt, and the lights went out completely. In the suffocating darkness, Ethan felt it before he saw it. A presence, massive and oppressive, standing inches away from him. He could hear its breathing, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the small space. The lights flickered on for a split second, and Ethan wished they hadn't. The figure was towering, its body made of writhing black tendrils, faces screaming silently from within its form. Its head was featureless, except for a gaping maw that seemed to stretch infinitely into the void. "Join us," it rasped. The lights went out again, and Ethan's screams were swallowed by the darkness. When the elevator finally reached the lobby the next morning, the building's security guard found it empty. The surveillance footage showed the elevator doors opening and closing repeatedly throughout the night, stopping at random floors. No one was ever seen entering or exiting. Ethan was never found, but his neighbors began hearing whispers in the dead of night when they rode the elevator. A faint, desperate voice pleading, "Don't get in."
Story number 3.
The corporate tower stood tall against the night sky, its glass facade shimmering like a beacon. Karen sighed as she stepped into the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She was the last one to leave, as always, burdened by deadlines and a never-ending workload. She pressed the call button for the elevator, stifling a yawn. The lobby was silent, save for the faint hum of machinery. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped inside, the space smelling faintly of metal and disinfectant. Karen hit the button for the parking garage. The doors closed smoothly, and the elevator began its descent. The first few seconds were uneventful, the floor numbers ticking down. 12, 11, 10. She leaned back against the wall, rubbing her temples when the elevator shuddered violently. The lights flickered, and a loud clang reverberated through the car. Karen straightened, her heart pounding. The elevator stopped abruptly at the 8th floor, the doors sliding open with a faint hiss. The hallway outside was dark. No lights, no sounds. Just an empty corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. "Must be a power surge," Karen muttered, jabbing the closed door button. But the elevator didn't respond. The doors remained stubbornly open, the darkness beyond pressing against the edges of the light inside. She stepped forward, peering out cautiously. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the oppressive silence. She stepped back into the elevator and hit the button again, harder this time. The doors started to close, but just as they were about to seal shut, something moved. It was subtle, a flicker of motion at the far end of the hallway. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer to the doors, squinting into the shadows. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The motion stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder with each step. A figure emerged from the darkness, its outline hazy in the dim light. "Hey!" Karen shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "The elevator's stuck. Can you help me?" The figure didn't respond. It just kept walking, its movements unnatural, jerky and disjointed, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Karen frantically pressed the buttons on the control panel, trying to force the doors to close. The figure was getting closer now, close enough for her to see its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its head was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin. But it was wrong. Its skin was gray and mottled, its body twisted in ways that defied anatomy. The doors finally started to close, but not fast enough. The figure reached the threshold just as they were about to seal, and its hand shot out, impossibly long fingers wrapping around the edge of the door. Karen screamed, backing into the corner of the elevator. The creature pried the doors open effortlessly, stepping inside with a strange, guttural clicking sound. "No, no, no," Karen cried, hitting the emergency button repeatedly. The elevator jolted suddenly, the doors slamming shut with the creature inside. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the car into a chaotic strobe of light and shadow. The creature's distorted form lurched toward her, its limbs stretching and contorting as it emitted a low, inhuman growl. Karen grabbed her purse, swinging it wildly at the thing, but it passed through its body as though it were smoke. The creature's face, or what should have been its face, was inches from hers now, a void of nothingness that seemed to pull at her very soul. The elevator dropped. Karen's stomach lurched as the car plummeted, the numbers on the panel blinking erratically. Her screams echoed in the confined space, drowned out by the roaring sound of the descent. And then silence. The elevator stopped with a bone-jarring thud. The lights steadied, revealing that Karen was alone once more. Trembling, she looked around, her chest heaving. The doors slid open to the parking garage. She stumbled out, her knees weak, clutching the wall for support. Her car was parked just a few feet away, but something felt wrong. The garage was unnaturally still, the air cold and heavy. Karen's phone buzzed in her purse. With shaking hands, she pulled it out. The screen displayed a message. "Welcome to the 8th floor. You'll never leave." The lights in the garage flickered, and the shadows began to move.
Story number 4.
The old hospital was set for demolition in a week, its halls long abandoned and filled with dust and decay. David, a freelance photographer with a fascination for urban exploration, decided it was the perfect place for his next project. He had heard the rumors about the building, how the staff used to hear screams from empty rooms, how patients disappeared without explanation, but he dismissed them as local legends. The air was thick with mildew as he wandered through the desolate corridors, his flashlight casting long shadows. He reached the elevator shaft, its doors slightly ajar. The control panel was caked in grime, the buttons missing their glow. "Probably hasn't worked in decades," David muttered, peering into the gap. He could just make out the elevator car, seemingly stuck between floors. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside and pressed the button for the basement, half expecting nothing to happen. To his surprise, the doors groaned shut and the elevator jolted to life. The ride was rough, the machinery groaning as it descended. David chuckled nervously, gripping his camera. Guess this relic still has some life in it. The car stopped abruptly with a lurch, the floor indicator frozen on B1. The doors didn't open. David frowned, pressing the button again. Nothing. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder. Then a voice crackled through the old intercom. A woman's voice, soft and shaky. "Help, please, it's so dark." David's heart skipped a beat. He glanced around the car, the dim light flickering. "Who's there?" he called out. The voice came again, this time clearer. "They locked us down here. We can't leave." David's pulse quickened. He aimed his flashlight at the ceiling and then at the corners of the elevator, searching for a speaker. The voice sounded impossibly close, as if the person were standing right behind him. Before he could respond, the elevator jolted again, descending further. The floor indicator went dark, and the air grew colder. David's breath came in visible puffs, and the faint metallic smell of blood filled the car. The elevator stopped with a shudder, and the doors creaked open. What lay beyond wasn't the basement. It was a long, narrow hallway lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The walls were lined with gurneys, each one occupied by a motionless figure covered in stained white sheets. David hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stay inside the elevator, but the voice came again, louder now, echoing through the hallway. "Please, help us." Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, David stepped out. The air was heavy, oppressive, the kind that made it hard to breathe. He raised his camera, snapping a few shots. The flash illuminated the hallway for a split second, revealing something that made his stomach drop. The figures under the sheets weren't motionless. Their heads twitched toward him, jerking at unnatural angles. Fingers with brittle, discolored nails clawed at the edges of the sheets, pulling them down just enough to reveal gaunt, eyeless faces. David stumbled back, nearly dropping his camera. The figures began to sit up, their movements slow and deliberate, their hollow sockets fixed on him. "No, no, no," he whispered, backing toward the elevator. He hit the closed door button repeatedly, his hands shaking. The figures were getting closer, their feet dragging across the floor with sickening scratches. One of them opened its mouth wide, far wider than it should have been possible, and let out a bone-chilling scream that echoed down the hallway. The doors finally began to close, but not fast enough. One of the creatures lunged, its hands snapping through the gap just as the doors sealed shut. David screamed as the long, withered fingers clawed at the air, the door closing with a sickening crunch that severed the hand. The elevator shot upward violently, throwing David to the floor. The lights inside flickered wildly, the severed hand twitching at his feet before disintegrating into ash. The elevator stopped abruptly, the doors sliding open to reveal the hospital lobby. But it wasn't the same as when he'd entered. The walls were decayed, covered in dark stains, the air reeked of rot. Outside the shattered glass doors, the city was unrecognizable, a twisted landscape of shadows and broken structures. David stepped out cautiously, his camera clutched tightly in his hands. The hospital doors slammed shut behind him, and when he turned, the building was gone. Only the faint sound of the woman's voice remained, echoing in the distance. "Help, please. It's so dark."
Story number 5.
The luxury hotel stood as a testament to grandeur, its gleaming marble floors and ornate chandeliers dazzling every guest who stepped through the doors. Ava had been sent there on a last-minute assignment to photograph the penthouse suite for a travel magazine. It was late, past midnight, but the editor insisted on having the shots by morning. She stepped into the elevator, her equipment bag slung over her shoulder. The control panel was sleek and modern, its buttons glowing softly. She pressed 40 for the top floor, and the doors slid shut with a gentle hiss. The ride started smoothly, the elevator humming as it ascended. Ava leaned against the wall, scrolling through her phone to pass the time. At the 13th floor, the elevator stopped. The doors opened to a dark, empty hallway. Ava glanced up, frowning. She hadn't pressed that floor, and no one was there. The air that wafted in was icy, carrying the faint smell of mildew. "Faulty elevator," she muttered, hitting the closed door button. But the doors didn't close. Instead, the elevator shuddered, and the lights flickered. Ava took a step back, unease creeping up her spine. Suddenly, the buttons on the control panel all lit up at once, their glow casting eerie shadows on the polished walls. A soft whisper broke the silence. "Ava," her name, faint but unmistakable, echoed around the small space. She froze, her eyes darting around. "Hello? Who's there?" There was no answer, only the faint hum of the elevator. The lights flickered again, and the elevator began to descend, slowly at first, then faster. Ava's heart raced as the floor indicator ticked downward in rapid succession. 12, 11, 10. The descent stopped abruptly, slamming her to the floor. The lights went out completely, plunging her into suffocating darkness. She fumbled for her phone, its flashlight the only source of illumination. The beam cut through the black, revealing the mirrored walls of the elevator. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. Ava stared, her chest tightening as she raised her phone higher. The reflection stood still, watching her with a twisted grin that didn't match her terrified expression. Its head tilted sharply to the side, the sound of cracking bone echoing through the car. "No," Ava whispered, backing into the corner. "This isn't real." The reflection's grin widened impossibly, its teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. It raised a hand, placing it against the glass. Ava screamed as the surface of the mirror rippled like water. The reflection began to push through, its hand emerging into the elevator, gray and skeletal, its nails jagged and blackened. She dropped her phone, the light skittering across the floor as she frantically pressed every button on the control panel. The elevator shuddered violently and the lights flickered back on. The reflection was gone. The doors slid open to an unfamiliar floor. Ava hesitated, peering out. It wasn't the penthouse. The hallway was long and dimly lit, lined with old peeling wallpaper. At the far end stood a single door, slightly ajar, with faint light spilling out. The whispers came again, louder this time. "Ava, come see." Her legs moved on their own, carrying her down the hall, despite the screaming protests in her mind. The closer she got to the door, the colder the air became. She reached out, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. Inside was a room filled with broken furniture and shattered mirrors. The walls were covered in scrawled messages, written in what looked like dried blood. "No escape! No escape! No escape!" In the center of the room stood a figure. It was her, but not her. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes black pits, and its body twisted unnaturally. Before Ava could scream, the figure lunged, its hands gripping her shoulders and pulling her forward. She stumbled back, falling into the elevator. The doors slammed shut, and the car plummeted downward, the lights sparking violently. When it finally stopped, Ava was in the hotel lobby, gasping for air. The doors opened to the pristine, bustling scene she'd left earlier. Guests moved about, oblivious to her disheveled state. She stumbled out, clutching her camera bag. When she glanced back at the elevator, her heart nearly stopped. Her reflection in the mirrored doors grinned at her before disappearing into the shadows.
Story number 6.
It was well past midnight when Lily left the office, the last of the fluorescent lights dimming behind her. The rain outside battered the windows of the towering high-rise, and the building was eerily quiet. She sighed, exhausted, and made her way to the elevator at the end of the corridor. The button for the elevator lit up under her touch, and soon the doors slid open with a soft ding. The car was empty, its polished interior reflecting her weary face. She stepped inside and pressed G for the ground floor. The elevator began its descent, the soft hum of machinery the only sound. Lily leaned against the wall, her eyes half closed, when the car suddenly jolted to a stop. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the car was plunged into complete darkness. Her breath hitched. She reached out, feeling for the buttons, but they were unresponsive. Panic began to creep in as she fumbled for her phone, the glow of the screen offering a small comfort. As she turned on the flashlight, the elevator lights flickered back on. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The car wasn't empty anymore. A man stood in the far corner, his head tilted down so that his face was obscured by a mop of dark, wet hair. His clothes were soaked, dripping water onto the floor, forming a growing puddle around his feet. Lily's heart raced. She hadn't heard anyone enter. "Excuse me, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. The elevator shuddered and began moving again, but instead of continuing downward, it ascended. The numbers on the display ticked upward. 10, 11, 12. "Wait," Lily said, stepping back. "I didn't press anything. Are you doing this?" Still, no response. The elevator stopped abruptly at the 13th floor, a floor that didn't exist on the building's directory. The doors slid open, revealing a hallway bathed in a dim, sickly yellow light. The man finally moved. He raised his head, and Lily gasped. His face was all wrong. His skin bloated and pale, his eyes sunken and black as tar. Water dripped from his mouth as he smiled, revealing jagged, broken teeth. "Coming?" he rasped, his voice gurgling like something drowning. Lily stumbled backward, slamming the closed-door button repeatedly. The man didn't follow her but stood perfectly still, his grin widening as the doors shut. The elevator lurched downward, faster and faster, the lights flickering madly. The floor indicator spun erratically, displaying numbers that made no sense. 37, 4, 999. The air grew colder, the walls of the elevator groaning and buckling as if under immense pressure. The lights went out again, and Lily was plunged into darkness. She clutched her phone, her hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the small space, but her reflection in the mirrored wall made her stomach drop. It wasn't her reflection. The woman staring back at her had hollow eyes and a twisted grin, water dripping from her face. The reflection reached out, pressing a hand against the glass, and Lily felt icy fingers wrap around her wrist. She screamed, yanking her arm back, but the grip was unrelenting. The elevator screeched to a halt, and the doors opened to a cavernous space filled with stagnant water. Lily was yanked forward, her feet sliding on the wet floor as the reflection pulled her into the mirror. Her screams echoed, and then there was silence. The next morning, the cleaning staff found the elevator car empty. The security footage showed it stopping at the 13th floor, but no one ever got in or out. Lily's coworkers reported her missing, but her belongings were never found. To this day, late at night, the elevator sometimes stops at the 13th floor. And if you're unlucky enough to be inside, you might catch a glimpse of her reflection. She's still there, her twisted grin waiting for the next passenger.
Story number 7.
The elevator doors gleamed like a silver portal in the dim light of the apartment building's lobby. Ethan had only recently moved into this old high-rise, lured by the cheap rent and its proximity to work. Residents whispered rumors about strange occurrences, but he chalked it up to urban legends designed to spook newcomers. It was late, and Ethan was returning from a friend's housewarming party. He pressed the button for the 14th floor, yawning as the doors slid shut. The elevator hummed softly, its ascent steady. At the 8th floor, the car stopped with a slight lurch. The doors opened to reveal an empty hallway, dimly lit and eerily quiet. Ethan frowned. He hadn't pressed that floor, and no one got on. Faulty wiring, he muttered, hitting the closed door button. As the elevator resumed its climb, a faint smell wafted into the car, something sour and metallic. Ethan wrinkled his nose, glancing at the floor display. The elevator bypassed the 14th floor entirely, the numbers ticking upward. 15, 16, 17. "What the hell?" he said, pressing the emergency stop button. The car halted abruptly, but instead of lighting up the button panel or chiming for assistance, the elevator went dead silent. And then the lights went out. Ethan fumbled for his phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cast shaky shadows across the mirrored walls. His reflection stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed, but something about it seemed off. The elevator jolted, and the mirrors cracked in unison, spiderweb fractures spreading across the glass. Ethan backed into the corner, heart pounding. A sound came from above, soft at first like nails scraping against metal. It grew louder, more insistent, until it became a frantic scratching. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice trembling. A low, guttural laugh echoed in response, reverberating through the confined space. The elevator plummeted suddenly, the force throwing Ethan against the wall. His phone slipped from his hand, its light extinguished as it hit the floor. The car came to a screeching halt, the impact leaving him gasping for air. The doors slid open, revealing an impossibly dark void beyond. A figure stood in the doorway, barely visible against the black. Its outline was jagged, like it didn't belong in this world. "Why are you here?" the figure hissed, its voice layered with whispers. Ethan couldn't speak, frozen as the figure stepped closer. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of sickly green light. "You don't belong," it rasped, the air growing colder with every word. The figure raised a hand, long and thin, its fingers ending in claw-like tips. The darkness around it seemed to writhe, creeping into the elevator like living shadows. "No!" Ethan yelled, slamming his fist against the control panel. The buttons flickered weakly, and the elevator doors slammed shut just as the shadows reached for him. The car shot upward, the lights flickering on and off. Ethan clutched the handrail, his heart hammering as the floor indicator spun erratically. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened to the 14th floor. The hallway looked normal, bright and welcoming. Ethan stumbled out, his legs shaking. He turned to look at the elevator one last time, but the interior was pitch black. Before the doors closed, he saw his reflection again in the fractured mirrors. It wasn't his face. It was the figures, staring back with glowing green eyes and a twisted grin. The doors shut and the elevator descended, the soft hum fading into silence. Ethan never used the elevator again.
Story number 8.
The corporate headquarters of Latham & Finch was an architectural marvel, sleek, towering, and cutting edge. But after 10 p.m., the building transformed into a hollow, lifeless shell. Most employees avoided working late, claiming the night shifts felt off. Julia didn't have the luxury of fear. She was drowning in deadlines and needed to finish her presentation for the next day. By the time she packed up her laptop and left the 22nd floor, the office was deserted. The building's main elevator gleamed in the dim glow of emergency lights. She pressed the call button, the metallic ding echoing in the still air. As the doors slid open, she hesitated. The car was unusually cold, a biting chill that made her shiver. She shook off the feeling and stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The ride started smoothly, the hum of the elevator the only sound. Julia leaned back, scrolling through her phone to check emails. The elevator stopped at the 17th floor. She glanced up, confused. She hadn't pressed the button, and the floor was supposed to be under renovation. The doors slid open to reveal an unlit, dusty hallway. "Hello?" She called out, stepping closer to the door but not crossing the threshold. No answer. The doors stayed open far longer than they should have, refusing to close even when she hit the door close button repeatedly. Finally, they shut with a groan and the elevator began descending again. But instead of going to the lobby, it stopped at the 13th floor, a floor that didn't exist in the building directory. The doors opened slowly, revealing a dark void. Julia's phone flickered, its screen dimming and dying, plunging her into near-complete darkness. A faint, rhythmic sound began to echo from the blackness. Thump, 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 like someone walking barefoot on cold concrete. "Is someone there?" Julia's voice quivered. A low whisper answered, indistinct but chilling. She strained to make out the words, but they seemed to come from all directions at once. The elevator jolted violently, and the doors slammed shut, trapping her inside. The lights flickered back on, but they were dim and tinged with a sickly yellow hue. When she glanced at the mirrored walls, her blood ran cold. Her reflection wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, staring back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Then, slowly, it raised its hand to the glass. "Let me out," the reflection mouthed silently, its lips forming the words. Julia stumbled back, her hand fumbling for the emergency phone, but the line was dead. The reflection's mouth twisted into a grin, its teeth unnaturally sharp. Before she could react, the elevator plummeted. She screamed as the car hurtled downward, that faster and faster, her stomach lurching with the sensation of free fall. The lights exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging her into darkness. The car stopped with a deafening crash, and for a moment, everything was silent. The doors creaked open, revealing a place that couldn't possibly exist. The lobby was distorted, its walls warped and pulsating as if alive. Shadows moved independently of any light source, creeping along the floor like liquid. A figure stood at the center, its face obscured by a hood. It raised a hand, beckoning her forward. "No," Julia whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." The figure laughed, a guttural, otherworldly sound that made her skin crawl. The shadows surged forward, spilling into the elevator like a living tide. Julia turned to hit the buttons, but they were gone. The control panel was a smooth sheet of metal, offering no escape. The shadows wrapped around her ankles, pulling her down. Her screams echoed through the elevator shaft as the doors slammed shut. The next morning, the elevator was found empty on the ground floor. Maintenance workers noted that the car seemed colder than usual, but there was no sign of Julia. Security footage showed her entering the elevator, but it never stopped at the lobby. Some say if you ride that elevator late at night, you might catch a glimpse of her reflection in the mirrored walls. She's still trapped, begging for someone to take her place.
Story number 9.
The Willowcrest apartment complex was old, its faded bricks and creaking infrastructure standing as a testament to years of neglect. Emma had moved in just a week ago, lured by the low rent and its proximity to her new job. The elevator was the building's most notorious feature. It was ancient, clunky, and prone to breaking down, but Emma had no intention of climbing 10 flights of stairs after a long day. It was past midnight when she returned home, the halls silent except for the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. She stepped into the elevator, the air inside stale and heavy. The dim bulb overhead flickered as she pressed 10. The doors groaned shut, and the car began its slow ascent. At the 3rd floor, the elevator stopped. Emma sighed. Another glitch. She stabbed the closed door buttons, but it didn't respond. The doors slid open to reveal a dark hallway that seemed unfamiliar, even though she'd walked past it earlier that week. "Hello?" she called out hesitantly, stepping closer to the doorway but not exiting. The hallway was silent, its shadows unnervingly deep. Before she could react, a soft, shuffling sound echoed from the darkness. "Is someone there?" The sound grew louder, closer. She hit the closed door button frantically. A hand darted out of the darkness, its pale and skeletal, gripping the edge of the door. Emma screamed as the doors jolted but didn't shut. The hand withdrew and the shuffling noise ceased. Trembling, she backed into the corner of the elevator, her breath ragged. The doors finally closed and the elevator resumed its climb. But something was wrong. The floor indicator began skipping numbers. 6, 9, 13. Emma frowned, her chest tightening. There is no 13th floor, she whispered to herself, clutching her bag tightly. The elevator stopped with a jarring screech, and the lights flickered off. In the suffocating darkness, Emma felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the small space and the reflection in the mirrored wall opposite her. But the reflection wasn't hers. The figure in the mirror was gaunt, with hollow eyes and a crooked, unnatural smile. It tilted its head, watching her intently, and then its lips moved silently. No, 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 Emma whimpered, backing into the corner. The reflection raised its hand and pointed. The lights flickered back on. The elevator doors slid open to an impossible sight. A vast, crumbling room filled with rows of broken mirrors. Each mirror reflected her, but the reflections were wrong, twisted, decayed, and staring at her with malicious intent. From the far corner of the room, something moved. A figure emerged, crawling on all fours, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by long, matted hair, but the sound of its labored breathing filled the air. Emma frantically hit the button for the ground floor, her hands shaking. The figure stopped crawling and stood upright, its full height towering. It tilted its head back, revealing an eyeless face with a jagged, gaping mouth. "Stay," it rasped, its voice a guttural growl that echoed through the car. The elevator lurched violently, the doors slamming shut just as the figure lunged. The descent was agonizingly slow, the walls groaning and creaking as though the entire shaft would collapse. Emma's breaths came in short, panicked gasps as she clutched the rail, waiting for the nightmare to end. When the elevator finally reached the lobby, the doors opened to reveal the familiar, quiet space. Emma stumbled out, her knees weak, and turned to look back at the car. Her reflection in the mirrored doors grinned at her, a grin that didn't match her own face. She ran out of the building, vowing never to set foot in that elevator again. The next tenant to use it wasn't so lucky.